So right now, I want to give a special thanks to Meredith Walker, who's going to come up and have a great conversation with General David Petraeus, who I am a huge fan of, by the way, and I'm a huge
of Meredith or the general
of both. Absolutely, absolutely.
Hello, Meredith, my friend. How are you?
Doing great, Scott and David. Thanks so much.
It's great to have you. And Meredith has a storied background. She's got a big background. She was an economist with the Dallas Federal Reserve. She basically knows everybody on the planet. She's an Uber connector. She can talk on any topic, et cetera. And she was actually the person that connected us originally with General Petraeus. So I have to thank her for that. My undying gratitude for that. And of course, she'll introduce more about General Petraeus. But General Petraeus is a past recipient of our Magellan Award, and he has hosted many of our events. He's shown up hurt right after, he's played hurt, shown up right after shoulder surgery and things like that. Didn't keep him from getting here, et cetera. So he's a tough guy, and he's a brilliant guy.
Oh, for sure.
And I want to thank you, Meredith, for doing this. And we're going to turn it over to you right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott and David. Good morning, General. How are you?
Love and life, thanks. Greetings from New York. Thanks, Scott and David, as well.
Yes, David did not mention I was also a Federal Reserve economist in New York.
Oh my gosh, in the Big Apple.
That's right. And I think maybe you remember several years ago when I was working with the East-West Institute, I got to meet you there at your offices at KKR.
I did. Yep. Great to see you again. Nice to see the photo in the background.
Thank you. Yes, that is the Flying Tigers P-40 flying with some F-16s.
I'm surprised the F-16 could go slow enough and the P-40 could go fast enough.
Indeed. Well, we thank you very much for joining us today for a 4-star tour of the world, the contemporary geopolitical situation. But before we dive into that, I would love for you to tell us a bit more about KKR Global Institute.
Sure. I was brought on not quite 10 years ago after leaving government to help KKR essentially be the wisest, smartest, I guess, most informed investor we could be when it comes to geopolitical and security risks and so forth, and to integrate that analysis with the risk from the analysis by our macroeconomic team and also our environmental, social, and governance issues analysis team. We put all of that together. And interestingly, what's happened over the course of the last 10 years is that this has become vastly more important to the investment process, to the diligence process, than it was, frankly, when Henry Kravis and George Roberts first hired me and asked me to establish the KKR Global Institute. In fact, during that time, and I think it's a great way to sort of, I guess, describe the context of the last 10 years as we get into this conversation, we have essentially transitioned or evolved from an era that I think we used to see as one of benign globalization, in which economics determined geopolitics, in which all you cared about was the lowest priced labor, materials, manufacturing, assembly, transportation. You didn't care about the source, all the rest of that. And by the way, it was all sufficiently dependable in supply chains that you could practice just-in-time logistics as well. And now we are in an era of renewed great power rivalries. It's evolved over the course of this particular decade. And in this era, geopolitics now drives economics. It really constrains, it creates the context within which, again, investments, economics, and trade take place. And no longer are we only looking for the lowest cost labor, materials, manufacturing, assembly, and so forth. We also realize that we have to have diversification of the locations of those activities because supply chains are not as reliable as they were before in an age of pandemics and other challenges. We realize that strife, conflict is very much back and having a huge impact on a variety of different markets and sectors, especially obviously with the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine and brutal invasion of Ukraine as we're seeing at present in particular. And so all of a sudden, a process that used to be important when you first went into a country that you'd not invested in before, and perhaps it was a developing nation, now is important in investment decisions involving North America, Europe, and the developed world in Asia, because all of them have exposure in some way to the new dynamics of great power rivalries that have returned in a very significant way. Most prominently, most significantly, obviously, with the enormous rise of China and what now our national security advisor describes as severe competition is the relationship between our two countries. You can't decouple it all, but there is selective decoupling, and there is a variety of what we used to call industrial policy, even mercantile decisions taking place, in addition with a variety of other developments that are changing dramatically. Again, a variety of different economic, trade, and investment relationships, and again, the context in which those take place. So the KKR Global Institute has become a much more central element in the investment process and the diligence process, again, together still with the macroeconomic analysis, environmental, social governance, and of course, needless to say, the financial deal team. But it is now something that takes part for many, many different possible deals, rather than just those the first time that we're going to, again, Philippines or Vietnam or the former Yugoslavia or even Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and so forth. And it's been a very interesting journey and transition for us, just as the world has evolved during that particular time.
Well, thank you very much, General, for that overview. Before we dive into the current geopolitical confrontations taking place, just a follow-up to that, I remember many years ago the phrase was commercial diplomacy. And I'm wondering, I imagine when you began at the KKR Global Institute, you could think more commercial diplomacy, but as these rivalries heat up into almost direct confrontation, are the challenges in your role increasing as well?
Very much so. Again, you literally have to de-risk your portfolio to the extent that you can when you identify different geopolitical and security threats or challenges. So in the case of Russia, for example, we actively examined our portfolio and essentially set out to de-risk it to the greatest extent possible when it came to exposure to Russia and Ukraine. And we did that all the way back in 2014. We revisited that late last year. That doesn't mean that you still don't have thousands of individuals working for companies. And again, keep in mind for the audience, we own about 110 or 20 companies around the world. We have nearly $500 billion under management, and then we have minority investments in another 100 or so companies as well. And there were thousands of employees of companies we owned in Europe in particular that were still in Russia or Ukraine working remotely. And some other exposure of some of these, but we had dramatically reduced that. We had literally de-risked it, and we had identified what these employees should do if there was an invasion threatening and so forth. And in fact, we carried out the contingency plans that we'd made for a variety of these different situations that we had. So yes, it's become much, much more important. And we're working very hard now to ensure in a world where entities lists continue to increase, where there are export controls on, for example, most recently high-end microchips, and a variety of other restrictions and so forth that have to do with trade and investment with China. So again, not only do you want to be legal, you want to be responsible in what it is that we do, noting that you can't decouple. I think that's where the analogy of the Cold War is more than a bit flawed. We had no real commercial investment relationships with the Soviet Union back in the days of the Cold War, whereas the US and China are each other's top 3 trading partners. So again, how this is done has to be done, again, not just legally and responsibly, but thoughtfully. And that's indeed what it is that we're seeking to do. By the way, no one would like to see the relationship between the US and the Western world and China be as mutually beneficial as is possible, more than somebody who has seen what happens in the event of conflict. And, we should not give up on that, but we also have to be very totally realistic about how the relationship has evolved. And that's really what we're seeking to do. And then to figure out how that should factor in to individual investment decisions and so forth.
Yes, listening to you, a lot of people have been saying, oh, we're entering World War III, but as a global economist, I'm beginning to think we need to rename that. Maybe it's Global War I, and how are we going to avoid that? I feel like in some respects, we're all on the front lines of this war in terms of business and cybersecurity, et cetera. So let's get into Ukraine now. I know you have been one of the leading proponents from the very beginning on how carefully we need to be watching this, what the United States can do in terms of leadership. After these 8 months and as the longest of long winters may be beginning, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think that the U.S., no one was more critical of the current administration on the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and the way in which it was done, frankly, than I was. In this case, I think you have to give considerable credit to the U.S. administration, which I think has done a very impressive job, even before the war, of taking finished intelligence products and then, if you will, laundering them so they could be released publicly as statements without exposing sources and methods. That's not as easy as it sounds, and I think they did a very impressive job in that, so that they established real credibility when everything they said was going to happen actually did happen, even though many in Europe and even to a degree in Kyiv did not want necessarily to accept that. So then the enormous support that we have provided, really leading the world and guiding the world, $18.5 billion in arms, ammunition, and material alone, another 13 plus billion of economic assistance, again, guiding, galvanizing, encouraging that by our EU, UK, and other Western allies and partners around the world, leading with the coordinating the imposition of financial, economic, and personal sanctions, as well as export controls, and continuing to tighten those, to add to those, and so forth. I think all of this has been very, very important. We are now in a situation, I think 8 months in, where there are a number of realities that I think are really important to discuss. The first is that because Ukraine has done such a vastly better job at total mobilization than has Russia, in other words, recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and employing additional forces and capabilities, aided enormously, again, by the arsenals of democracy, which has made this possible. But they have done, again, obviously the really, really hard work. And not to mention just the fighting and casualties and so forth. But they now have a larger and more capable military in Ukraine than do the Russians, which is astonishing, given that Russia is more than 3 times the size of Ukraine, and also that Russia has incredible advantages when it comes to energy, minerals, and other commodities. There's second reality is that there's nothing Russia can do about this. The partial mobilization, they'll provide additional fighters. They're frankly going to be cannon fodder in large measure. They're not well trained or equipped or even all that fit. They will cause problems. They can, especially in urban settings, they can be a challenge, but they're not the kind of combat capability that Ukraine is increasingly bringing into the field as they go through real training programs and equipping and all the rest of this enabled by the US and the West. What Russia can do, however, is punish Ukraine. And I've said this even before the Kerch Strait Bridge explosion, which brought about enormous use of missiles, drone swarms, and so forth from land, sea, and air, just hammering not military targets in Ukraine per se, but increasingly civilian infrastructure, especially energy generation, transmission, and water systems. This is a counter value, if you will, rather than counter force, to use that description, trying to break the will of Ukrainian people, but actually galvanizing even greater resolve at the same time that Russia is trying to break the will of the Europeans with the lack of natural gas going through Nord Stream 1 and 2 and other restrictions, which is not working. In fact, I've been in Europe 3 times in the last 5 weeks, and they're at over 92% fill of the capacity for natural gas storage. There are LNG carriers actually parked off the coast, waiting for additional capacity to open up, and the winter has been quite mild so far. So the prospects, touch wood, are that unless there's a really extreme sustained period of cold weather, that the Europeans will get through this without enormous rationing or other restrictions. In fact, the spot price of, not the futures price, but the spot price of natural gas last week when I was in London briefly went below zero. In other words, you were paying them to take it rather than the other way around as we saw in crude oil a few years ago, that the futures price still very elevated, still problematic, still going to cause probably real problems for industries in particular that use natural gas as a raw material. But they're not going to outsuffer the Europeans or the Ukrainians the way Putin thought they might, given that Russia has outsuffered the Nazis and Napoleon and others over the years. So the prospect is that Ukraine will continue to be on the receiving end of a degree of punishment. The additional air defense and ballistic missile defense systems are going in, two important ones that we're sending later this week or early next week. And the continued arms, ammunition, material that we're providing that are really enabling Ukraine, in particular, to push Russian headquarters, logistics stocks, assembly areas, and so forth, 70 kilometers from the front lines, because that's the range of the precision guided missile launch rocket munition Gimler's round that you could put it in a dining room table at that distance. So that's where we are. The Ukrainians are now determined to achieve Ukraine whole and free, which they define, I asked them recently, as including Crimea and that portion of the Donbass controlled by the Russian-supported separatists. Whether that's realistic or not, it is certainly in question. But at some point, not now, because neither side is inclined to negotiate, at some point, perhaps after much more tough fighting, tough casualties, further liberation of Ukrainian soil from that areas occupied by Russia since the invasion, at some point, there's going to have to be some kind of grand bargain, which has elements in it of, again, US with EU, UK, everything together with Ukraine. Again, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, as the administration says rightly, and talking about how they can extricate Russian forces who have suffered at least 4 times, I think, the losses in 8 months that they sustained in 9 years of tough fighting in Afghanistan, get out from underneath the financial, economic, personal sanctions and export controls. Ukraine stop being punished, and perhaps we announce or hold out the prospect for some kind of Marshall Plan together again with the EU, UK, Japan, others, and some kind of durable security guarantee, which would be necessary and without which a Marshall Plan cannot truly succeed. Harkening back to the original Marshall Plan, the success of which was not necessarily the amount of money provided to the really destroyed European nations in the wake of World War II. It was the security guarantee that the United States provided. All of that, I think, put together at some point, but neither side right now, neither Putin nor President Zelensky can go to the negotiating table and is inclined to do that. It's going to take much more tough fighting and tough casualties.
So we are in for a long, hard winter for them.
I fear, yes. And but it'll be a winter that on the battlefield is much tougher for the Russians than it is, I think, for the Ukrainians, who will be fighting on their own soil, fighting for their survival. This is their war of independence, really.
Absolutely.
And they approach it. There was a particular Ukrainian commander that came out of Ukraine to meet with retired Lieutenant General Hodges, someone had multiple combat tours together, and me during the Warsaw Security Forum. And he said, we'll fight them in our underwear this winter if we have to. They won't have to, because they've got good kit being provided again, not just by their own military industry, but by the West as well.
Well, their underwear and their business suits, right? We've seen so many Ukrainian business people taking up arms. It's incredible on LinkedIn,
Yes.
Those types of posts, imagining people,
Yes.
I don't know, like myself, really, right?
Everybody is mobilized, the
incredible.
entire country. And of course, no males were allowed to leave the country. And virtually every Ukrainian is trying to pitch in some way or other. Again, the idea that this is their war of independence is not an overstatement.
That's right. And I think using that line, their war of independence, let's turn to China for a moment. As we know, the Chinese government watching what's happening in Ukraine, all the surprises to Russia. What do you think that bodes for Taiwan? And what would you like to say on China?
Well, first of all, we should recognize what just happened, the 20th Party Congress. We saw a consolidation of power that's really unprecedented, at least since Mao. You see Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, and a very, very good and very thoughtful and very well-informed China watcher over the years, now the president of the Asia Society here in New York City, as he described it, President Xi has taken the politics in China to the Marxist left, great consolidation of power, the Leninist left, consolidation of power, economics to the Marxist left, the party intruding again in the economy in a way that had not been until more recent years. And then the foreign relations, foreign affairs, that to the nationalist right. Obviously, these directions are concerning, and we have to watch this very, very carefully. Our national security strategy just announced the national defense strategy in recent weeks, all identify China as the pacing threat, recognizing the need to dramatically transform our military capabilities, because of course, deterrence at the end of the day rests on two elements. It's a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. I think Ukraine is instructive. The US has shown a very substantial willingness to engage. The president has 5 times, not once or twice, but 5 times said that we would aid Taiwan. And of course, the lessons of Ukraine, I guess we hope, are that these kind of operations are really, really hard. And a 100-mile amphibious operation would be incredibly challenging, especially if that country has really mobilized the way that Ukraine has. And there's a lot of activity that needs to take place in that regard. Look, at the end of the day, obviously what we want to do is absolutely deter any conflict, and to, at some point down the road, again, get a degree of convergence that has been missing at current times. The idea being that, you cooperate where you can and you compete where you must. But instead, this has evolved into, again, what Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, has described as severe competition. That's a very significant term.
It sure is. It sure is.
Understated, very thoughtful, very bright, but understated guy. That's quite a statement. And it is, it's clarifying, if you will.
Well, before we conclude our talk today, I want to be sure we have a chance to discuss Latin America, given how many times you have traveled there for KKR, specifically with the election that just took place in Brazil. Lula himself has talked about already how close he wants to be with China, Xi Jinping giving him an immediate congratulations. And then Mexico, it's relations with Russia continue to shock me. I mean, even just recent news of a space agreement that they had signed a year ago, and it's some partnership on offshore oil exploration. What do these conflicts mean for our own hemisphere?
Well, in aggregate, I think it's always very hard to generalize about an area as large as that, which includes actually part of North America, Mexico, but then Central America and South America. But in aggregate, I think the concern is the rise of domestic populism in a number of these different countries. We've seen that in Colombia as well recently. You have the return of a populist, although Lula, I think, actually in practice is going to be more moderate and more of a centrist than people perhaps may expect. And certainly his predecessor, still the incumbent, obviously, was very much a right-wing populist in many respects. You see that, though, I think most concerning in Mexico, where López Obrador has reversed so many of the very important reforms that his predecessor first got the constitutional changes through, then the legislation to implement them, and so forth in the energy area and a variety of other areas. And where you see the further erosion of the rule of law and the continued growth of what essentially are criminal empires. And I think that's very, very concerning. They are our southern neighbor. They're part of our economic space, if you will. There's enormous opportunities for Mexico that will not be fully realized in terms of the idea of friendshoring or, again, reshoring because of increasing labor costs in China and elsewhere, also because of, again, dual use technologies concerns and so forth. So all of this I find, again, very, very concerning. And I say that as someone who was the co-chair of a Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on North America, together with former World Bank President Bob Zoellick, at a time when we were very enthusiastic about the opportunities there, and where the space has become much more challenging and much more concerning. But with that, I see two old comrades, retired General Keith Alexander, a great wingman, West Point classmate, who did such spectacular work with NSA in Iraq, building the real-time regional gateway, which he might explain. It was really the first cloud in its day, and we brought the applications engineers out there and did all the work out there, as opposed to back in the States, and they were about 5 times more productive because they couldn't drink out in Iraq and had nothing else to do also. But again, my thanks to him for all that he did at NSA and then later at Cyber Command in various times in uniform, and then when I was at the CIA. And ditto to retired Major General Kim Kreider, who I guess is going to interrogate him without enhanced interrogation techniques. But great to see both of you. And thanks, Meredith, for yet another great job as my interlocutor.
Thank you so much, General Petraeus. Truly appreciate your remarks and joining us here today.
A great pleasure as always. Thank you.